for her today, but I'm just saying welcome to Dialogues on Racial Justice. And thank you so much, Linda, for all these great series. It's been thought-provoking. I enjoyed last week's session. It was a lot, and to imagine 400 years in 2 hours.
2 hours. I was determined to do that.
Oh boy. So that, I was blown away by that session, Linda, and I thank you. I can't say enough thanks.
Thank you.
And thanks to the Friends Group for sponsoring this event, the Bethlehem Area Public Library Friends Group, and also thanks to the Bethlehem Historic District Association for sponsoring this program.
Thank you.
Welcome to another thought-provoking and educational program here this evening, and I thank you again for joining the Bethlehem Area Public Library. And just know that the last session will be coming up August 25th, and we will repeat that again at the end.
Yes.
Thank you. I turn it over to Linda.
Thank you. And so I would like to say welcome to everyone. Welcome back. Because I think, and welcome to new participants as well. So I'm excited to bring this topic to you. All of this is near and dear to my heart. But I think this one is probably the one that really touches me in a different way. When it comes to speaking about police brutality. So that's what today's workshop is. And what I wanted to do was not just talk about police brutality, but talk about policing in general. So that's why I wanted to start with the history of policing and then bring it all the way forward to the gradual militarization of the police. And before I get started, I have to let you all know that, first of all, just a reminder that we are recording, but I have to let you know that even though I, delete the recordings once I realize afterwards that there was nothing that I needed to follow up on, but today, Janine told me, because there's a city council meeting that is happening actually at the same time. So we aren't going to have as many participants as last time, although it still looks like a full house today.
Yeah, 16.
Yeah, so, but there's a city council meeting going on that's addressing issues of police brutality as well. And Janine told me that they want to use this workshop to show to the public. So, warnings, if you don't want your face to be shown, stop your video. And also if you choose, just, I guess, choose your words wisely. I don't know if it matters to anyone. But just so you know that this will be shared, I do not know who will see it. So just keep that in mind. Okay? Yeah, Liz, you have a question?
Who is they?
They being the city council. That's all I know.
And so the library is giving city council permission to use it?
No, what's happening is that we're going to make it public. We're going to put it on social media. So if anyone, we just want people to know that it's going to be public information for the world to see, not just city council, the whole world. If the whole world happened to go to the Bethlehem Area Public Library to view it. So we just want people to know that it's being recorded.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not necessarily, yes, city council wants to see it, but anyone can see it.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, just so we know. Okay, so let's get started. All right, so I'm going to start, like I always do, with a discussion, opening up our discussion with a question. So let me get to my slides. Here we are. And go to slideshow. And so the first question that I came up with is, how did the modern police force begin in the United States? And I wanted to bring that up because, you know, everyone's on social media, everybody has an opinion. And one of the things that I noticed is that a lot of people are not aware of how the police force actually got started. So who knows? Does anyone know exactly what it was that gradually turned into modern day policing? Does anyone know that history? Thaddeus has his hand up.
I'm not completely sure, but I think it involved like rounding up slaves or like rounding up runaway slaves.
Yes, that's exactly it. So they were called slave patrols, and that's exactly what happened. So we're going to start there, and we're going to talk about how that happened. And so slave patrols began for exactly that reason, not just rounding up slaves, but here the history of it. And you know, I have a lot of information in here, so as we go, I may not be speaking exactly to what that particular slide says, because I tried to give everyone as much information as possible. But you can take a look as I scroll through them. So what happened in the 1700s? It began in South Carolina with the slave patrols. And because slave labor was really the economic system of the South, there were concerns. There was a lot of fear about slaves leaving and trying to escape and no longer contribute to the slave system that was building white wealth. And so slavers created these slave patrols, and slave patrols would enforce the slave codes. And I don't know if you remember, last workshop we talked about the black codes. So remember, the black codes came about after the Civil War. The precursor to black codes, what came first, were the slave codes. So it was still all about policing black bodies. And it started out while slavery was ongoing. I think we have a participant waiting, Rhea. I'm sorry. If you can just check and let them in. So slave patrols would go out, and here we go. That is. Okay. Slave patrols would go out, and they literally policed every aspect of a slave's life. So they would punish them. They would go into the slave quarters. They would bring escaped slaves back to the slavers' land. They would do everything that you know, if you've ever seen a movie about slavery where you see them riding off on horses and bringing slaves back. That's exactly what it was. That's what slave patrols did. But the other thing that they did was they brutalized slaves. They brutalized them, they tortured them, and oftentimes, especially for the women, they raped them. So slave patrols were horribly racist in the South. And what happened, let me go to the next slide. Let's see. What happened was that they were afraid that slaves would rebel, like I said, and escape. And by about the middle, I think it says by about the middle of the 18th century, all the Southern colonies started passing laws to formalize the slave patrols. So this, as Southerners started seeing the need for them in order to keep slaves in line, so to speak, more and more states started also organizing slave patrols. So it was slave patrols, it was the night watchmen. It was also, I found this out, some of the soldiers, people that went out and fought for the Confederacy, they came back and they became slave patrols as well. And one of the things that really, as if it wasn't bad enough, you know, the existence of the KKK, but one of the things that also happened was slave patrols gradually morphed into the Ku Klux Klan. They were also a part of what policing was back then. And so they gradually just kept morphing into these more and more, as times changed, as we went from slavery to Reconstruction to, you know, that period of lynching with the KKK. Remember from when we talked about 400 years of oppression in the last one. This is what came out of this. So we go into now the way that these, if you look in this green box up here, like I said, it says returning Confederate soldiers formed vigilante groups, and they would rob and intimidate freemen. And some wealthier whites also started agricultural and police clubs. So this is what was going on in the South, and this is what the beginning of the police force started out as. So if we go here, this talks about how it turned into the KKK. And if you read this pink box up at the top right, it says the Klan is an extension of slave patrols in most direct, obvious ways. It's white men on horseback. They go out typically at night to terrorize African Americans. It is racial oppression continued from one generation to the next. They've changed the names from patrols to Klan. They've put on sheets, but the activities and the purpose remains pretty much the same. So that's how they morphed from one form to the next. And even during that time, that's when they actually started with uniforms and badges. So that came out of that time period as well. So the next question that as we start leading into, so that's how policing began. So now we're going to start leading into police violence, okay? So the question at this point is, as the slave patrols began to morph into the modern police force, and lynchings by the KKK began to decrease, because remember we talked about that in the last workshop. There was a decrease at when it became so egregious, you know, to have public lynchings. Then that's when Jim Crow segregation started coming into play around that time. So I want you to know the time frame as we go through this. So as slave patrols began to morph into modern police force and lynchings by the KKK began to decrease, what particular form of police violence began to increase? I don't know if anyone will even know that, because you may not even know where my mind was going when I started forming this this workshop. But think about what you know about policing. Think about what you know about police violence. And if you go ahead.
So
Go ahead.
there are a few comments here in the chat. I don't know
Oh,
if you
okay.
want to read it or
Stop sharing. No.
okay.
Okay. So while we're thinking about that, let me go to the comments. There were various eras of policing across time, slave patrols through the intelligence data-driven predictive policing errors. Slaves were employed in the slave patrols. True, there were slaves that were part of the slave patrols, but they still were policing black bodies for white supremacy, for the slavers. They weren't policing slaves for their own benefit. It was still for the benefit of the economic system that was based on slave labor that privileged white people, not black people. Then someone says, yes, true, but we also had Sir Robert Peel, who ran the London Metropolitan Police Department in 1829, who influenced modern American policing. Policing was highly politicized since its inception until the 1960s, when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. Again, that's true, but it still began as slave patrols. There was influence from policing that occurred in England, but that is not the policing system that was implemented in this country. So it's still, I mean, we can't deny the history. The history is that it was slave patrols that began as the historical part of the what morphed into policing today. Okay, so let me go back to sharing my screen. Okay. So what I wanted to discuss, and the reason I brought that question up, is because what began to happen was police torture, which led to many, many false confessions, which led to false imprisonment, which led to gradually, over many, many decades, has since led to mass incarceration. But I wanted to bring this up. This book in particular that I used for both of these excerpts looks at policing from the 1930s to 1955. And if you see in the top box, it says in the 1930s and 40s, law enforcement officials in the South often resorted to physical and psychological coercion or coercive means to force African American suspects to make statements and confessions and secure their convictions in subsequent trials. And then in the bottom box, it says, as state representatives of white supremacy, sheriffs, deputy sheriffs, and city police officers occupied a prominent position within the social order of the South. Their actions were aimed at maintaining the prevailing status quo and protecting the privileged economic, social, and political standing of white citizens. Police violence against African Americans played a key role in achieving these objectives. And then the next slide, the reason I brought that up is because I wanted to show you current day. So this is talking about the 30s and 40s. And it also in this box on the left talks about the practice of torturing Black prisoners or suspects generally took place outside the public eye. But then if you look to the right, this is current day in Chicago. This is what is talked about regarding police torture that has taken place for residents in Chicago. And this is a lawyer that has done some research. And what he says is that police officers who took an oath to protect and serve the residents of Chicago have instead done the opposite. They have beaten residents of Chicago. They have electrocuted them. They have tied them to radiators and left them for hours. They have suffocated them with typewriter covers and plastic bags. They have raped them. So this is modern day, and this hasn't changed. And if we look at the next slide, I included some very well-known cases where this has happened. So this has happened with the Central Park Five, Khalif Browder, George Stinney, Rodney King, and Abner Louima. Very, very briefly, if you want to know these three over here to the left, their stories are on Netflix. They're actually in Rodney King as well. They're all of these have documentaries on Netflix telling their stories. The Central Park Five, a woman was raped in Central Park, a jogger, a white woman, and she didn't know who did it. But the police force was so insistent upon finding anybody to blame for this. These boys were, I think, from 14 to 18, if I recall. And they coerced them, they beat them, they did everything that they could to actually get them to confess to doing the crime. And one of the tactics that's used, and we'll see that more later, one of the tactics that's used is actually where people that are poor, that can't afford lawyers, that have to depend on a public defendant, oftentimes don't get the best representation. So they make plea bargains. They plea bargain. I'm sorry. So they plea down the charges. So if there's a mandatory minimum for rape, let's say 20 years, they tell them just confess and you'll only get 5 years. Or turn on your friends and you'll only get 5 years. we know that so-and-so did it. You need to tell us that so-and-so did it. And this is part of what was done to these boys. They had them turn on each other. They had them falsely confess. And I think most of it was done when they did not have their parents with them. So these were teenage boys, young boys in police stations by themselves, being coerced and beaten and psychologically abused by the police department, and they confessed to a crime that they did not commit. And DNA evidence and the confession of the killer is what finally set them free after they spent years in jail. The one in the middle, Khalif Browder, he was stopped because someone said he stole a backpack. This boy did not. He was one that would not admit to doing something he didn't do. He maintained his innocence the entire way. They put him in jail anyway. He was convicted. He spent, I don't know how many years in jail. I would have to look that up. But what happened was he was so brutalized in prison, and he was also put into solitary confinement for, I think, weeks, maybe months at a time. And they finally did release him, but by then he was so psychologically damaged that when this boy was free, young man, he was a young man by the time he got out, he actually he committed suicide. The documentary was done while he was still alive, thank God. So he got to tell his own story, but he couldn't handle it. They broke him psychologically, and he committed suicide. George Stinney, down bottom left. This boy was 14 years old. 2 white girls were murdered. The police just wanted to find anybody to blame it on. They blamed it on him. They knew that he didn't do it. They just blamed it on him anyway, and they executed him at 14 years old. His story is on Netflix as well. Abner Louima, top right, he was sexually abused. He was sodomized by the police. That was in New York. I forget exactly where. But you can find his story on Google. If you just Google his name, you'll see all the articles. I don't think a documentary has been done about his story. But then Rodney King. Rodney King was one of the first police brutality cases that actually got videotaped and we got to see, because it was so horrific for the world to see. But people in LA, you know, in highly urban areas. I'm sorry, Thaddeus, I see your hand is raised. I'm going to get to you as soon as I'm done with Rodney King. But what happened was that people, the whole country, found this to be so unbelievable that the police could do something like this, and thought that it was just, you know, this is just one case, and the police never do anything like this. But Black people were trying to say, no, in our neighborhood, this happens all the time. We just happen to catch it on video. And so that's part of what has unfortunately been happening in this country, is that there's been all these things that have been going on, all this brutality that has been committed against us. But every time we try to tell our stories, we are either silenced or we are not believed. Because America never wants to admit what America does. And so I will stop there and I will go to questions. Or Thaddeus, I think there's comments and Thaddeus has his hand up. So Thaddeus, you want to say something?
Sorry for if it was raising a few times.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, okay.
I wanted to say, I think a lot of the misconception that leads the conversation sometimes is people are under the impression that the administration of justice process starts in the courtroom. But for me, and I think for most of us as Black people, it starts when the police officer is even in our area. And so, you know, to us, it's like, you can consider me guilty as I stand 500 feet from you, or 500 meters, or where. If you can see me, you can consider me guilty. Whether you should either clearly see me or not. And so I think that's the misconception that leads the conversation.
Right. Yep. I'm sorry. I'm reading all the comments that. So look, everybody had lots of comments. So just talk. Tell us what's on your mind. I see Vertel. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. I see Vertel and Rodney, you were going back and forth a bit, having a little debate about when what's going on here? Oh, tough on crime. Yeah, I'm gonna get to that. Yep. Anyone else? Any comments?
I think, Linda, that I would say we can't forget that from the moment African bodies were deported, stolen, whatever language you want to use, snatched from African land, that we've been in bondage and in chains from that point on.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, we've been policed. Black bodies has never been free in America.
Right.
You know.
And I think you may have missed the part because I talked about the slave patrols and the slave codes. Yep.
Yeah. So I just wanted to mention, we can't ever forget that point. We have been policed from the time our ancestors came over here. And that's very, because we hadn't been free to roam space.
Right.
And all these killings you were talking about, and let's not forget how state sanctioned it has been.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
95% of the time, police get away with it, even when the video is showing. Eric Gardner.
Yep.
So,
Tamir Rice.
Yeah.
We could go through a whole list. Michael Brown. I mean, it's horrible. The things that they've not been held accountable for. So I want to go to the next slide. And it's going to be sorry. Oh, here we go. Okay. It's going to be a discussion question. Someone's TV is playing, I think.
You should be able to mute the person, Linda.
I don't know who it is.
I think it might be Denny, because hers is the only one actually, and Hammond's phone is not muted.
Okay, so can anyone name the key factor that marked the beginning of the militarization of the police? So I want you to, let me just explain. I'm building a story here, if you haven't noticed that yet. So I'm going from the beginning from the slave patrols, then to the KKK. And I'm building the story to get us to understand how this process has occurred over time, how we have been policed since we were brought here in chains. So there was one thing, and I think someone said it in the comments. Actually, a couple people said it in the comments. So don't look at the comments if you don't know. But I want I want you to think about the 60s. And there was one thing with one particular president, but other presidents followed suit. But the first president that started this with being tough on crime and, you know, we're going to declare war on something.
I was actually going to say, I thought maybe it was Reagan's war on drugs.
Yes.
Or Nixon, actually.
Nixon. Yes, that's absolutely correct. That's what started it. It was Nixon's war on crime / war on drugs. But it was the war on drugs that he used as a war on crime. But was it really a war on drugs? No, it wasn't. But we're going to get to that. So it was called a war on drugs, but it was truly a war on Black bodies. And so the reason I asked, the way I phrased my question, I said, name the key factor that marked the beginning of the militarization of the police. And I did that because I want us to make the connection that if we have a president that declares war, what do we do during wartime? We bring in the military. We bring in warriors, so to speak. So declare war, and then that gives the justification for the militarization. And that's how this whole process started to begin with the militarization of the police. And so I want you to see up here in this orange box, midway down, it says, in the drug war, the enemy is racially defined. The law enforcement methods employed have been almost exclusively in poor communities of color, resulting in jaw-dropping numbers of African Americans and Latinos filling our nation's prisons and jails every year. And then this one down here, I'm going to read it. I actually included this quote in the last workshop we did, but I didn't get a chance to read it, so I didn't know if anyone actually read it on their own. But this is very important, so I'm going to read this now. Because this is why we can rightfully call the war on drugs a war on Black bodies, because that's exactly what it was. And a Nixon administration official admitted to it. So that's what this says. This is in the documentary 13th. There's a news clip of a news correspondent who reports that a Nixon administration official has admitted that the war on drugs was all about throwing Black people in jail. He said the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or to be Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt these communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So this is why the war on drugs, and it just continued. This is the thing. This is not new. It's just policing that's taking a different form depending on what decade we're in. So now it's the war on drugs. Nixon declares it and he starts it, but Reagan is the one who took it to a whole different level. And that's when we started seeing the overcriminalization of Black people. And not only that, it was made legal by, sorry, I have to admit something. It was made legal by laws that were put in place. So let's look at this briefly. In the first box up here, midway down, it says a strong case could be made that most nonviolent individuals are better off staying in society and participating in a civil society program rather than being alienated from other people and quarantined with violent offenders. The biggest catalyst for overcriminalization is nonviolent drug offenders. That's the purpose of the war on drugs, to get as many nonviolent, smaller, I don't know what the right word is, but nonviolent, lesser, okay, I don't know prison jargon, so forgive me for losing my train of thought here, but if it's easier to get nonviolent offenders in jail, that's what was done. And so it provided more Black bodies to fill up prisons. So we could go off on a tangent at this point and even talk about mass incarceration and the way that prisons have been privatized because of Black bodies that were overcriminalized and thrown into jail on either real charges that were nonviolent or coercion, torture, whatever is done where they get people to actually confess to crimes that they didn't commit and then put them in prison. So all of this goes hand in hand. And all of it has to do with how Black bodies are policed in this country. So then it was made legal. So we have this war on drugs. So we declare war. We need a military presence to take care of this war. So we declare war, we overcriminalize, we make it legal, and the way they made it legal were through the Rockefeller drug laws, which, if in the second box, if you see, it was through no-knock warrants and the stop and frisk bill. And the no-knock drug raids are probably the absolute most heinous type of brutality, short of just choking someone out like they did to George Floyd, that could be enacted on the Black community. That's how Breonna Taylor died, because of a no-knock drug warrant that was signed. And so this bill that Nelson Rockefeller put forth, the no-knock bill allowed police to get a special search warrant authorizing them to ignore the, I should say, knock and announce, not know and announce. Sorry, that's a typo. So it allowed them to ignore the knock and announce requirement so long as a state judge agreed that there were exigent circumstances. And then the stop and frisk bill allowed police to stop, detain, and pat down anyone in a public space whom they found suspicious. And then in the bottom, I got some, I didn't put it in table format, but some statistics say that currently Florida and Oregon ban no-knock warrants. 13 states have laws explicitly permitting no-knock warrants, and the remaining states issue them based on a judge's discretion. So only 2 states ban them currently, and that's it. The rest are allowed to do them. And then we move forward, and further laws were put into place by Bill Clinton here. And that's the 3 strikes law and the mandatory minimums. And what happened was that a 12-year-old girl in a highly publicized case was abducted and killed, and Clinton enacted the 3 strikes law. And here's a quote where he says in this video, this documentary 13th, there's a news clip of him saying, when you commit a 3rd violent crime, you will be put away, and put away for good. 3 strikes and you are out. And so this is what allowed Black people, again, to be put away for good. A lot of them for either bogus crimes or nonviolent crimes. And then the mandatory minimums were also implemented by Clinton. And this is where a judge is not even allowed to use their own discretion in giving sentences, but if a certain crime is committed or someone is accused of a certain crime and convicted, even if they didn't commit it, if there's a minimum sentence that they have to serve, that's the sentence that they receive. And part of, if you recall, when Hillary ran for president against Trump, this was brought up a lot. The 3 strikes law and the mandatory minimums was brought up a lot during her campaign, because so many people, this one was really harmful to the Black community. And I think this is just me speaking. I think that Hillary didn't get as many votes as she could have gotten because of the history of what Bill Clinton did with the 3 strikes law and the mandatory minimums. So next, remember we talked about overcriminalization, police torture, police coercion. This is how the criminal justice system plays into that. And this is what we're going to look at in the top box. So it says, for many of those swept up within the criminal justice system, full-blown trials of guilt or innocence rarely occur. Many people never even meet with an attorney. Witnesses are routinely paid and coerced by the government. Police regularly stop and search people for no reason whatsoever. Penalties for many crimes are so severe, and that's because of this mandatory minimums. That's why these crimes are so severe that innocent people will plead guilty, accepting a plea bargain to avoid the harsh mandatory sentences. And it says even children as young as 14 are sent to adult prison. And then in the box below, it says the system of mass incarceration is structured to reward mass drug arrests and facilitate the conviction and imprisonment of an unprecedented number of Americans, whether guilty or innocent. And so that's how we start to lead into how the police became more and more militarized. So first, Nixon declares a war on drugs, which was actually a war on Black lives. It gets legalized through the Rockefeller drug laws, the no-knock law and the stop and frisk law, and then also Bill Clinton when he implemented the 3 strikes law and the mandatory minimums law. So a war is declared, it's legalized, it gets Black bodies to be overcriminalized and swept up into the criminal justice system. They get thrown into the mass incarceration system. And then what happens is now we have full justification for the police force to now be militarized. Because it just looks like Black people are just losing their minds, they're just criminals, they're thugs. And then that's the other thing. Start throwing out these dog whistle politics phrases, and Rodney, I'll get to you in a sec. Start talking about, Black people are thugs, Black people are criminals. Even with the Central Park Five. If you watch that documentary, you'll see that Donald Trump, way back when, he actually took out a full-page ad to ask for those 5 boys to be executed. And they were completely innocent. And then when this documentary came out and Trump and the, I think it was the prosecuting attorney, were interviewed, their justification was, well, they were guilty of something. They may not have been guilty of the rape, but they were guilty of something. So instead of taking accountability for what they did to those boys, who are now grown men, I need to stop calling them boys, but instead of taking accountability for what they did to them, all they do is continue to portray the image that Black people are just criminals. At some point in somebody's life, a Black person's going to do something wrong, so they need to pay the price, whether it's now or later, whether they're guilty now or innocent now, they need to pay the price. So I'm going to stop here because I know that a few of you have some comments, want to say something. Rodney, I saw your hand go up, but I also see a lot of comments. So Rodney, go ahead.
I just wanted to go back to something you said last week.
Okay.
Which is in relation to what you're saying now, and that's the interrelationship between enslavement, the 13th Amendment, and the prison system.
Mm-hmm.
And so the 13th Amendment, quote unquote, abolished slavery, except you be a felon. So the prison system is the new enslavement. Slavery by another name is the criminal justice system or the prison system.
Right.
I also saw someone, he was writing in the comments that Obama also was part of this.
Who? I'm sorry.
He said he said don't forget Obama in a sense. Obama didn't make any changes to the criminal justice system until he was about to leave office. And I know one thing he did do was put an end to private federal privatized prisons, because this is big business. Let's not be mistaken. Prison, big business. And the privatization of prisons is big business. And Obama, at least he did close the federal prisons, are privatized, yet it's been repealed since Trump has been in office. So so they started back again after that was repealed. So just want to share that. But there's definitely connection between enslavement, the 13th Amendment, and
Absolutely.
the system being the new slavery.
Absolutely.
What it is.
Absolutely.
State sanctioned.
And it all goes hand in hand. And it all has to do with a way to continuously keep white people at a level of superiority over Black people, over Black bodies. And it started way back, again, when we were brought in chains, and it has not ended. It just takes a new face. It takes a new form. It hasn't ended. And the thing is, even with the civil rights movement, you know, a lot of people, and I think I said this in the last workshop, a lot of people focus on just that it was about voting rights and it was about desegregation. It was also about police brutality. That was a big part of it as well. That's why all those quote unquote riots, which I hate to call riots, because rioting is another word that's constantly associated with Black people. It wasn't that they just decided to go out and start fighting and rioting no, Black people were being killed by the police. All this civil unrest that happened, especially in the 60s, in Newark, in Detroit, in Watts, in Chicago, and we could name tons of cities. It was because of police brutality. It was not just because of voter suppression. Not to say that that was a big part of it as well. But the glorified stories from the civil rights movement is, oh, Black people got the right to vote and they get to sit at the lunch counter now. But that's not the only thing it was about. And I think the reason that police brutality gets left out of that story is because it's still going on. It has not changed.
May I just want to say something about, I want to go to the plea bargain section, and I think that is so important to discuss too, because what happens, again, a lot of kids, they take the plea bargain. And in the book titled The Pack, with the three brothers who became doctors, and one of them was actually arrested. And had he taken the plea bargain deal, he would have ruined his whole life. And he just mentioned that in the book to say that, you know, it's so important that we educate our children that, you know, when you're stopped by the police, or if you're arrested, you say nothing until someone comes. Right. If you have no knowledge whatsoever. And right. That is so important, because a lot of people's lives, young Black kids' lives, are just ruined because of the plea bargain deal. I mean, totally ruined. And also another thing that I wanted to talk about is the rise of the warrior cop and the no-knock. Yes. And someone mentioned that, you know, it's not the same for, you know, Blacks versus white when it comes to policing. And so the no-knock system, you know, that came into play, you know, way back in history, but it was pertaining to whites, whereas because they were looking at white homes, your home is your castle. So you wouldn't, you know, police officer wouldn't dare to come into your property because your home is your castle, and therefore they have to knock on the door. But now when it came to Black people, it was a totally, you know, different situation. Then everything changed. The laws changed, the policies changed. But we don't know what happens when they go to, you know, the same thing, you know, they have to actually knock. They knock. They have to not, because again, your home is your castle and you can't just go into somebody's home.
Right. Yep. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is another question. What was the first unit of the police force to begin military tactics against civilians? I think a lot of people will have the answer to that one. You can just call it out. I don't want to stop sharing the screen. Does anyone know? Okay, I'll give you a hint.
Was it the SWAT teams?
Yep, it was the SWAT teams. So the Special Weapons and Tactics Team. And it started out, well, I'll get to that in a minute. But what I want to show you is how it says, you know, many police departments today are so heavily armed with Pentagon-supplied hand-me-downs. And so it's tools of war like M16 rifles, armored trucks, grenade launchers, and so forth. And part of the story, quote unquote, the story about why militarization occurred was because of the war on terror. And you'll hear that being said, that it didn't happen because, you know, they were policing Black people. It happened because of the war on terror. No, it started because of the way that all the history that I just went over. It happened because of that. The war on terror got swept up underneath it as well, and so got added onto what was already occurring, what the process that was already occurring. And then we could say, and now we have a war on terror as well. And then that could also be justification for militarizing the police. And so it was a bunch of factors. I'm not going to say that it was only Black people, but Black people was, policing Black people was the biggest factor, because it was also, what's her name? Patty Hearst, who got kidnapped by a group out in California and was being held hostage. There was a standoff with the police there out in the streets. And if there's a documentary we're going to watch part of, if you watch that whole documentary, you'll see a little bit more about that. And also, what also led to it was a college campus. There was a sniper who went on a white college campus and was killing college kids. And that was also part of the reason SWAT teams came about. So I'm not trying to say that the war on drugs and killing Black people was the only reason, but it was the main reason. And then other things got swept up into that and gave further justification for militarizing the police. And then down here in this bottom box, it says, as SWAT teams spread across the country, police were ramping up the war on drugs under President Reagan. Police were given more authority to enter people's homes without knocking, to search for drugs, and that increasingly became the job of the SWAT teams. Originally, he said, he meaning this Professor Peter Kraska. So originally he said that SWAT deployment was supposed to be reserved for truly perilous situations, hostage taking, high-powered shootouts, and the like. Now these teams execute routine warrants in no-knock drug raids, bursting into homes with a show of force that often far exceeds the threat to them. And down here, says other critics like the American Civil Liberties Union note that a stark racial disparity with blacks and Latinos are more likely than whites to be the targets. And then I have a couple of graphs here from the New York Times that show how SWAT teams increased from 1983, the number of cities that had SWAT teams. Back then, it looked like it was about 15%, and then up until 2007, and so now we're at 80%. Those cities with populations between 25 to 50,000 have SWAT teams. 80% of those cities have SWAT teams. And then here's the other thing. SWAT team deployments, more than 80% of them are for drug raids. That's why it's not about the war on terror only. It is truly about the war on black bodies. 80% of SWAT team deployments are for drug raids. And this came out of the New York Times. So let's see if we have time. I put a lot of information in this. I think we have time. I want us to see a snippet of this video. This video talks about the militarization of the police, but the part that I want us to see is a part that actually, it's a training seminar. So the other thing that goes into militarizing the police is the training that they receive. And that's a big part of it, but that's not the only part. But I wanted to show this. So in this documentary, the narrator says, in the USA, the police are trained to overreact. And in some training sessions, they're even taught to kill. Dave Grossman, officer training instructor, incites the police officers to act as killers. He even preaches vigilante justice. And this is the documentary I want to watch. Just in case I can't get to it for whatever reason, this is on Amazon. If you have Amazon Prime, you can find this documentary. It's called USA Fear the Police. So I'm going to try it now and see if we can get to it. Oh, here we go. Awesome. Okay. It's at the 43-minute mark. Can everyone see? Can you hear?
No, we can't see anything. We could hear from your computer, but we can't see anything.
Okay, I'm sorry. Say again.
We can't see it.
Oh, you can't?
No, we can't.
Yeah, Linda, we're not seeing it at all. We could barely hear a little bit.
Right. Could you?
Oh no.
Why don't you try to copy and paste?
I'm sorry. Do what?
Just like how you're sharing your slides with us. If you close that out and copy and paste it into your browser and then share it that way, it should work. Whereas we can see it. You can try.
So you're seeing my slides right now?
Yes, we are.
Oh, okay. So tell me what to do again, Rhea? I'm sorry.
Why don't you close your slides and then copy and paste that link you have there into your browser,
Okay.
and
Gotcha.
then share it with us that way.
All right. Give me a moment. I'm sorry, everyone.
Also, could you try copying and paste it into the chat session? Let me see if I could open it that way too.
I'm trying. I am trying to figure this out. So if anybody has a comment that they want to make while I'm trying to do this, please feel free.
So what do you guys think about the session so far? I mean, I know it's a lot and so forth. So can we have some feedback about, what you've learned so far? Anything that's totally gripping and that you weren't aware of? Or is there anything that's bothering you about, anything that you've seen? Yes, go ahead, Kate.
Well, I mean, it's not surprising to me, but it's, Linda, you're fantastic. You're such a wonderful speaker. Thank you so much for doing this for the library.
Oh, you're welcome.
It's overwhelming. It's the way that everything, that the past lives in different forms in the present, just as insidious or even more insidious because it looks like something else, right? It's just really, it's a lot.
I had no idea how all this fit into a pattern. You know this, you heard about this or that act, or these things, but the chronological order in which you put these certainly helps us understand the development of the way the police are today, as well as the whole way Black people have been treated over the years, and it's just eye-opening.
I was reading an article this week about there was a man who is in prison for life in Louisiana because he had his third crime, and his third crime was stealing a hedge trimmer. He's in prison for life. He didn't kill anyone. And his other crimes were not, I think one was a burglary, and the other one was, the first one I think was like a robbery, but the last one was for hedge clippers. He's in prison for life in Louisiana, and he has 10 years of hard labor. And it's just, it's one thing if you're trying to get people to pay their debt to society, but when does it, how much debt do you have to pay? I mean, if you're trying to truly put someone in there to be rehabilitated so they can come out and live a successful life, why are things so horrible and so extreme that you're just it's an overbearing punishment that it's hard for them to even come out and readjust themselves?
Right.
I think, Liz, you had something to say? Liz?
I was just going to say, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I was just going to say earlier that it was, I think, important to point out that these aren't necessarily new issues and just a pattern, right. And that it's, I think, easier or natural for us to say, like, look at what just happened, instead of saying, like, this has been happening. We just have right. modern ways of seeing them, which maybe allows us to re-examine the patterns with that lens. But once you start peeling back the layers of history, you see the evolution of the problem. And the book Rhea recommended, the library has it. It's just currently on my shelf.
Yeah.
But it does that really, really well. Each decade, it goes through and gives you data and numbers, so you can kind of examine the evolution of the warrior cop.
Exactly.
Which I always appreciate.
That's not what I meant. Was when I said it just happened. Is 2020 and it's still happening.
Right.
I guess what I'm saying.
Right. And
on the fact that it's happened, I know it happens. It's the fact that it is still happening in 2020, and it's not even within the confines of what they say. It's just a over extreme sentencing.
Right. And Teresa, it wasn't necessarily a direct comment to you. It was from much earlier in the conversation.
Oh.
Yeah. So yeah, no, it wasn't at all. Just, it wasn't trying to reply to your comment specifically. It was from much earlier.
Sorry.
Yeah, but I always find it helpful to kind of see the pattern if I can visualize it. So I appreciate that book in particular.
Right.
But yeah, it is something that is, I think when all of the information is laid out in front of you, you do have that moment when it's just kind of like, it is, again, what Teresa said, like it's 2020, like.
Right. Absolutely. And it's still going on. And that's the whole point that I've been trying to make with this workshop, is to show that it has always been going on. Police brutality is nothing new. We're just seeing it now. But it's always been going on. And the thing is, the stories are out there. You just have to be willing to look. All this, and this is why I provide as many slides as I do and as much information as I do, because I don't want anybody to think, oh, this is just Linda's opinion. No, it's not. First of all, Linda doesn't know that much, okay? Linda just loves doing research. And so I read, I research, I go on Google to find information. I mean, it's out there. All you have to do is be willing to open your eyes and seek it. And that's all it will take. But also to know the right resources to go to, because all the resources that I give you, and if you read through my slides, every single slide, the resources given at the end. These are all academic books. These are books that I used when I was studying, but also books that I found on my own. So you just have to be willing to do the research. Sharon, yes.
Yeah, it's also, I just read a very good article in the New Yorker about the New York City police force, and about how this kind of culture and behavior among police, I don't want to say policemen, police, is reinforced by this whole culture of the silent, the big blue line. You never rat out a fellow cop. So even policemen of color, policewomen of color, feel they can't say anything when they observe this in others.
Yes.
Because then, all hell breaks loose. So it's all reinforced by a whole culture of police brutality that no one is allowed to prosecute or say anything about, testify about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, I still have a lot that I want to get to. So I'm not going to try, I'll try one more time. I don't think we're going to get to see the video, and I truly, truly apologize for that. But the link is in the slides. So if you can watch it on your own, please do. Here we go. I think I can do it now.
Oh, wonderful.
Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Yes. Okay. Now let me know if you can hear it. Can you hear it?
Not yet. We can read.
All right. So as you can see, it's a promotional video for private police officer training. Okay. And this is what this documentary is talking about. It's talking about the militarization of the police, but it's talking about the way in which they're trained to kill. So read quickly. I'm going to play it anyway, but keep up and read it, because I don't know how to make it. I'm so sorry. I don't know how to make the sound.
Right.
So here we go.
Well, Amazon doesn't want to lose money, so they made it purposely so that you can't share it with us.
Yeah, we're not able to see anything.
Yeah, we can't see anything. It's
You can't see it? I thought you could see it.
No, we see your screen with the language on it, with the words on it, but that's all. It's a black screen.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a copyright issue, Linda. That's
It's
probably
copyright.
why.
Shucks. All right. So when you get a chance.
Wait a minute. Here's something. We see something. What was that?
And I closed it out.
Okay.
So let's move on. So the video, like I said, it's just showing the way that police are trained to be violent. And that's part of the problem as well. And that's part of what is also leading to the further militarization of the police. The other thing that I just wanted to show, I'm not going to...
Can I have the sweet and sour, please?
Teresa, we can hear you.
Oh, sorry.
So I'm going to skip to this part. This is how the militarization occurs. It occurs through these programs. One of the biggest programs is called Program 1033, that authorizes the Army to provide old equipment to the police forces. And there are 100 of these depots throughout the country. And if you look down, it says down here, midway, since 1995, the date of the program's creation, $6 billion of material has been transferred to the police. Today, you can come across tanks in deepest America or in big cities. All over the country, sheriffs are adopting a policy of zero tolerance and profiting from the generosity of Program 1033. And that's where the police are getting most of their equipment from. But on this slide, it also talks about other programs. So it's not just Program 1033. In this last part right here, it talks about the Department of Homeland Security, some Department of Justice grant, and other programs that are in place to get old military equipment to the police. And look at this picture down here. I found this on Google. You see this little kid on his bike riding alongside these tanks. That was a sad sight for me to see, because that looks like the projects, looks like a housing project in the background. But yeah, so let's recap. So we have the slave patrols, we have KKK, vigilante groups, police torture and false imprisonment, the war on drugs, the Rockefeller drug laws, and overcriminalization, the 3 strikes law, mandatory minimums, mass incarceration, the criminal justice system, SWAT teams, the militarization of the police, and Program 1033. And what does all that lead to? People being brutalized by the police. So this is not a one-time thing. This is in the history of the United States. So we're going to switch to police brutality. I have a lot in here because we're coming up on 8 o'clock. So I'm not going to go through everything. But as we know, we're gonna look at this pink box here. Based on observations and interviews conducted in 1949 to 1950, William Wesley found that police behavior in a community with a large Black population reflected officers' concerns. The police believed that Blacks are naturally prone to criminality and that they pose a particular threat to police authority. Thus, situations calling for extra-legal violence frequently involved Blacks being perceived as disrespectful to the police. Not only were Blacks being particular targets of illegitimate violence, but also the police felt impunity from sanctions because Blacks lacked political power. And that was back in the 1949-1950s. Blacks still lack political power, and that is why many of the things that are happening to us are still occurring, because of our lack of political power. For this slide, just in the second paragraph of this first box, it says politicians from the presidents on down get this message. The message being that where in the paragraph above, Professor Patricia Williams says that white America just wishes that Black people would just go away and shut up and stop taking up so much time and food and air, and then the world would return to its Norman Rockwell loveliness, and America could be employed and happy once more. And then the author goes on to say that politicians from presidents on down get this message and translate it from policies that give priority to whites most of the time and only work for Black people in the short run as a way of working for whites in the long run. And then she says the police are not stupid. They understand their unspoken mission and that it conforms to the fears and prejudices regarding Black people many of them have harbored since childhood. And it says in this bottom box, there has never been a period in our history where the law and order branch of the state has not operated against the freedoms, the liberties, the options, the choices that have been available for the Black community, generally speaking. And to ignore that racial heritage, to ignore that historical context means that you can't have an informed debate about the current state of Blacks and police relationships today, because this didn't just appear out of nothing. This is the product of centuries-long historical process. And to not reckon with that is to shut off solutions. So I have a couple of other slides in here that you can read on your own about police brutality. And then here I just got some data that I was able to pull up for this year for Chicago, for police misconduct complaints that have been filed. And I just wanted to compare African Americans against white Americans. And if you go down and you see there's 33 versus 5 complaints filed for excessive force, 2 versus 0 for firearm discharge at an animal, mind you. The police are going around killing people's pets as well. And then verbal abuse was 7 versus 2. So the total so far in Chicago for police misconduct complaints for the Black community, there's a total of 42 complaints for Blacks versus 7 for whites. So that's out of the total, it's 85 points, because the total, if you add it up, is only 42 complaints out of the total number came to 85.7% for blacks versus 14.3% for whites. And when blacks are only 13% of the country, that's a whole lot of black people that are being brutalized. So this one I wanted to do as a little exercise. I think we have time to do it. I want everybody to just take a moment and list the names of some of the victims that you know of police brutality. Anybody that you can think of. We'll just take like a minute to do this. But I do want you to write it down. Write it on the back of your paper or somewhere, because I want to do something with that information. So I want you to write it down. So anybody that you can think of that you know has been a victim of police brutality.
Are you referring to people that's in the media or people
In the media, yes.
Okay.
Okay, so let's stop there. And now what I want you to do is count how many are men, how many are women, and how many are children. And just write your totals. And then I want you to share your numbers. So, Kate, can I call on you?
Sure.
Okay, so what do you have for men, women, and children?
I had 6 men, 2 women, 2 children.
Okay. Liz, what do you have?
6 men, 3 women, 2 children.
Don? Oh, Don, you're muted. Oh, he's counting. You're muted, Don. Unmute.
10 men, 1 woman, 2 children.
Rhea, what do you have?
You're muted, Rhea.
You're muted.
Actually, 6 children. I would say, you know, I didn't write them down, but
Okay.
I'm just thinking out of my, you know, off my head. I would say maybe 10 men that I can, you know, actually think of. And actually, there are quite a few women. For now, 5 women.
Okay. And Jan?
I'm just kind of blank, so.
Okay, no problem. Anyone else? Anne?
Yeah. Oops. Can you hear me?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I have 3 men and 2 women and 1 child.
Okay. Sharon?
I have 5 men and 2 women.
5 men, 2 women. Okay, so anyone else want to share? Or are you kind of getting the point that I'm trying to make? You're getting the point, right? Is that we always think of police brutality, we always have men in our mind. And the problem with that is, well, number one, men do tend to get brutalized more. But the problem is that women's stories are not told as often as men, and children's stories are not known as often as men. And so that is what I wanted to bring out of that little exercise, is to make us, I see your hand, Liz, one sec.
Oh yeah, no, I don't want to interrupt.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want us, and this is for me as well, because I have always thought of police brutality in terms of men. Teresa, I'm sorry, I see your hand is up too. Let me get to Liz and then Teresa as soon as I just make my point. So I had to really make it a point for myself to pay more attention to the brutality cases that occur with women and with children as well. And even now, if I did this exercise myself, I could name Tamir Rice as Trayvon Martin. I think that's the only 2 children I can think of, honestly. And so this is as much of a lesson to myself as it is for anyone, is that we have to be cognizant of those that have been left out of the picture when it comes to our discussions on police brutality. Okay, Liz?
I was just going to say that even when it comes to talking about men and children, I think when it comes to Black men and Black young adults, we often have a tendency to look at teenagers especially and automatically categorize them as men, or not even, like, even if a boy is 12, we'll talk about him as a man, and the media will portray him as a man. And you have to really take a minute and look at their age and look at the picture and say to yourself, that is not a man, it's a child. Like, he is a child. And it's a narrative that is lost and erased. I looked at my own list and had to pause and say, like, that is a child. Like, he is a child. He's not a fully grown man, because the stories surrounding those people tend to paint them as so much more of an adult, and they may have more of a life than most adults, but that does not mean that they were not children.
Exactly. Yep. Teresa?
Yes. With the exercise, I mean, I think it's great that we're highlighting the victims and coming to the realization about men versus women and children. But it also brings to my mind, I don't know but one officer's name that has ever done this and caused these people to be victims, which is, when they put it on TV, you see the person that died. You don't even see, you may see them one time or never. Who did this? And so, you know, it's a little different from where you were going, but it just, because.
But that's a good point, because, you know, there's been, and I don't know where it started, but there's been this shift in thinking where people don't want to give the authors more attention, so they don't say their names. But by not saying their names, we're also not holding them accountable, and it allows them to be perceived as no longer guilty of what they've done.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a really good point, Teresa.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to say something to, I have a 14-year-old son, and I think it will hit home for me because I do notice the children. I may not remember their names, but I can see their faces. And so it's real. For me, it's really, really gripping to think about it, and to think of my son, that, it could be my son if he is in a certain place, or, sometimes he wonders why I'm so overprotective, or why I don't want him to be out at a certain time because this neighborhood is safe and this and that. And so, it's like, I just have, this fear factor, regardless of neighborhood or whatever the neighborhood is. I just have this fear factor that, anything is possible. And so I do pay attention to the kids. There are a few kids in Brooklyn that were gunned down by police officers, 12 and 14, and, things like that. And the only reason why I'm saying Brooklyn is because I grew up in Brooklyn, and again, I just honed in to certain things that happened. And so I do pay attention to the kids.
Yeah. Yep. And just quickly, because we're running out of time, I'm not going to go through the rest of the slides, but I encourage you to please read them, but I will summarize them as quickly as I can. So what I did was I went through and put in a lot of slides on police brutality against Black youth and police brutality against Black women as well, because I wanted to bring attention to their the violence that they suffer as well. With Black youth, it's not, I'm sorry, it's not just like the case of Tamir Rice, who was gunned down by a police officer in the park. Where it's happening, where it's most prevalent, I found out, I didn't even know this, is in the schools with school resource officers. And that, it said that one of the sources I looked at said that that's actually the segment of law enforcement that is growing the most right now, is school resource officers. And that's where these children are being brutalized. Number one, it's inside of a school. Number two, these kids don't have their parents or protection from these officers. And number three, I also wanted to bring it about because we, as a culture, as a country, we have to start understanding that brutality does not just mean that somebody got killed. People are brutalized in many different ways. And with these kids, it's behind closed doors, and it's a different form of violence that occurs with them. I mean, we've seen some of the videos where girls are being punched in the face, girls are being thrown over, in a school cafeteria. And what's happening is that, and the reason why this is happening is because school discipline is not being handled by school personnel. It's being handled by the school resource officers. And so what that also causes, so it's not just the brutality, but now we talked about the school to prison pipeline in the last workshop. So now we have, these little kids that we can now start feeding into the criminal justice system. So these are kids at 12, 13, 14 years old who are getting criminal records that are going to follow them for the rest of their lives. And I can speak to this personally. Thank God we had the judge that we did, but when I was teaching, I had 2 students burst into my classroom during exams, holding their hands like this, like they were, and pointing, it was just their fingers, but doing this and making gun sounds, like they were shooting up students in my class. I called the principal. I wanted the principal to handle it. Principal called the resource officers. Those children got arrested. They got arrested. They were put in handcuffs. I saw my students in handcuffs being taken away by the police. I don't know what happened to one of them, but the other one was a girl and one was a boy. I had to go to court to tell them, look, you can't do, you're not putting that girl in juvenile detention. She made a mistake. She shouldn't have done it, but I didn't want that child getting arrested. I called the principal because I wanted the principal to handle it, but the principal didn't. And so these are the things that happen to our youth.
Right.
2 Black children. And so this is part of the problem that is really, it's horrific for some students. It really is. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about was with Black women. Brutality against Black women goes back to slavery. And not just with the slave owners, also with the slave patrols. So with Black women, it wasn't just about whipping them and beating, all the things that also happened to Black people in general, men, women, children. With Black women especially, it was rape. That was the form of brutalization that has always occurred to Black women since slavery. It's been in slave culture, it's been with the slave patrols, and it is still happening with the police today. And it talks about especially poor women, women who may be drug users, these are women that society has cast aside. But what also happens, unfortunately, is that they talk about how trans women are also victimized. So these police are purposely targeting women for their sexual preferences, for whatever they deem as a quality, a bad quality within a woman. And it's racialized as well, because the book I read is not just Black women, it's women of color, but Black women are the largest group out of the women of color that this happens to. They said it happens, police come to their homes and rape them. They rape them in their police cars. They just named all these places where this occurs to women, and women are silenced because they're not believed, and because it's the police that are doing it. Who are they going to call? The police? I mean, so this is the situation that women find themselves in. And part of what these, I have 2 books about, actually I think they're both on my Kindle, so I can't pull them out, but they're listed in the slides. But if you read these books, please read some of the stories. It's horrific, and I mean horrific. what happens. So on top of the beatings, on top of women being killed, women are brutalized in the most horrendous form possible for a woman to have to be victimized by, and that's by rape. And that's because Black women are looked at as promiscuous. First of all, that's the myth. Just like Black men are mythologized as criminals and thugs, Black women are mythologized as being promiscuous. And it's still a way to control Black bodies. Still. Teresa, you had your hand up.
I actually forgot to put it down, so I apologize.
Oh, okay. And then the last thing that I wanted to say, and then we'll go back for the last 5 minutes for closing remarks. I have some slides in here about civil unrest, because that's the next point. Like I said, I'm painting this broad picture of everything that happens. So we have everything that leads up to the police brutality, but then what happens when we have all this police brutality? The next thing is civil unrest. And so when we look at, the larger scale, quote unquote, riots, that go all the way back, to, I want to say back to slavery, because insurrections were happening during slavery. And see, and this is the same, they get different names. So it was insurrections at that time, riots, civil unrest, and so, but it's all the same thing. And it's all occurring for the same reasons, because of brutalization against Black bodies. And so when I brought up this other book, this is one that I talked about in the last session that we had. This was talking about the reasons for the riots in the 60s, and said the same thing. It talked about segregation, lack of economic and political disenfranchisement, but it also named police brutality. And what I also did was I put in comments in the slides from the Department of Justice when an investigation was done on the protests in Ferguson when Michael Brown was killed. And it's the same thing. It says that, as detailed in our report, this investigation found a community that was deeply polarized and where deep distrust and hostility often characterized interactions between police and area residents. Our investigation showed that Ferguson police officers routinely violate the Fourth Amendment in stopping people without reasonable suspicion, arresting them without reasonable cause, and using unreasonable force against them. Thus, the Civil Rights Division found that the combination of Ferguson's focus on generating revenue over public safety, along with racial bias, has a profound effect on the Ferguson Police Department's police and court practices, resulting in conduct that routinely violates the Constitution and federal law. The department also found that these patterns created a lack of trust between the Ferguson Police Department and significant portions of Ferguson's residents, especially African Americans. And so there's that. And then the last slide I have, last two slides, you can read those on your own, talks about a problem that we have in this country of how police use of force is reported. And the problem is that there is not a national database that exists yet that has all of the data that is needed to get an overall picture of police brutality in this country. Right now, one does exist, but reporting the data is voluntary. So at this point, and you'll see, I included this slide, and then I included a whole excerpt that you can read through that talks about why it's a problem and why the data is it's unreliable, because it's not creating a proper picture when it's voluntary, and there may be 16 out of 50 states that are reporting their statistics. And they also talk about the problem. The other problem is that there's a national database on violence that is committed against the police. That's been in place for a while now. But there's no national database on the violence that the police commit themselves. And with that,
Yep, we have 2 minutes.
yes. So I'm sorry. Comments, questions, thoughts? Anybody want to cry now and just throw up your hands and say, what do I do? I mean, honestly, I can't. I've been in tears so much since this has been going on. Not since, it's always been going on, but since it's become more widely known.
What do you? Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I think what we have to do is to, now that this movement is happening, because Black Lives Matter was a taboo to say once upon a time. And so now people are not afraid to say it. And so there are these protests and there are demonstrations and so forth. And, you know, which will, I hope, would lead to policy changes. And so therefore, we shouldn't give up, and we should be part of that fight in whatever fashion. Someone said, some of us are writers, some of us are speakers, some of us are organizers. So where your passion is and where your strength is to use those strengths and join an organization to make sure that this does not continue into the future, because something has to happen and it has to be a drastic change, whereas we don't give up whatsoever. Don't give up. Get involved, do something. Don't be silent about anything, nothing whatsoever. Don't be silent. Raise your voice, have the courage to show up and let yourself be seen, no matter what the consequences. There might be consequences, but you have to have that courage to stand up and voice your opinion, regardless.
Well, I think, Linda, all of your workshops, culminating to tonight, you are helping us to see that it's a greater system than just one place. It's a very, very large system that needs to be worked on in a lot of levels, because it was never a system built to provide equity. So,
Exactly. And that's exactly the point that I've been trying to drive home. Yep.
And I want to thank you, because I never really stopped to think about it as systematically and historically as bringing it together as you have. And so I have a new definition of anti-racism. It's much broadened.
Good.
It's
I'm
not
glad.
just speaking out for an individual. You have to speak about the system.
Against the system, exactly.
Yep, exactly. That's exactly it.
The system is doing what it's built to do, right?
Right, exactly, Kate.
Oh, you need to break the system.
Yep.
policy change with protest, with like what Rhea said, like using what you have, however you can use it.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
And I think that the key is policy.
Yeah.
And the book How to Be an Anti-Racist, Kendi, writes a lot about that. Policy. I mean,
right.
You can't. I mean, that is so important.
Yes, absolutely. And also, please watch the documentary 13th on Netflix. That will open your eyes not just to mass incarceration, but to the way that corporations enact policies. I didn't even know that Walmart was responsible for helping to get the Stand Your Ground law enacted.
Mm-hmm.
And when Walmart did that, gun sales went up for them.
Oh yeah.
So
that's why I try my best not to shop there. And a lot of people don't know these things, and again, the power of money and economics and this and where you spend your money. That's why it's so important for people to educate themselves.
Yep.
You have to.
A lot of corporations are involved in lawmaking that we know nothing about. So that's where the change is going to come. Changing policies and changing laws and exposing some of these systems that are doing exactly what they were meant to do.
Yeah.
See you in 2 weeks.
Yes.
All right, guys. Thank you so much,
everybody.
All right.
Joining us.
Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Thank you.
Going to go eat dinner now.
Bye.
All right. Bye.
Bye.